So now we'll talk about section 4.2, spirituality and art. So in this sense, spirituality refers to the ways that different belief systems, beliefs in narratives and their various interpretations, how those beliefs have inspired artists for millennia. So spirituality here encompasses a sense of being connected to others, as well as an awareness of one's own mind and body, and the general wish to understand life's meanings, both within the world and beyond. Um, Spirituality can be a source of inspiration, or it can be a way to express or share one's beliefs. Um, Various societies have their own view or views of the sacred. There are different gods and goddesses, deities, spirits, ancestral spirits. Regardless of what a society considers sacred or spiritual, art has long played a role in how humans sort of interact with the spiritual. Art helps us envision, understand, honor, and communicate with the sacred or the divine. Artists often communicate stories about specific religious figures or deities to help explain their importance or make them more memorable or more accessible to the general population. Religious images can serve to help focus the thoughts on the faithful by giving concrete form to abstract ideas. And in some cultures, images are understood as conduits through which sacred power flows, or sometimes images serve as dwelling places for specific deities or beings. So here we have an example from the ancient Greeks. This comes from the Temple of Zeus at Olympia in Greece. This was the birthplace of the Olympic Games. These are sculptures from the west pediment of the temple, constructed about 460 BCE. It depicts a legendary battle between the Lapiths of Thessaly, or the divine ancestors of the Greeks, and the centaurs, or the half-human, half-horse enemies of the Greeks. So, according to the story, there was a wedding feast for the Lapith king. The centaurs were invited, but those who came drank too much and tried to abduct the bride and many of the other women. And so it caused a battle. So here we have the Lapiths depicted as sort of idealized figures. They're quite rigid in their stance, and they lack emotion. Apollo is at the center of the pediment, the apex there. He was the god of the sun and associated with the poetic arts, medicine, and he represents reason, order, and male beauty. Now, on the other hand, we also have the centaurs. These are meant to be barbaric. They have more dramatic gestures, kind of ferocious or fearsome expressions. They represent change, chaos, and madness, and their drunkenness associates them with the Greek god of wine, Dionysus. Now, this event is also portrayed at the Parthenon. So the Parthenon is the largest building on the Acropolis in Athens. It's dedicated to Athena Parthenos. And the sculptural program, which was designed by the artist Phidias, it sort of reflects his aesthetic vision, but also really conveys a number of political and ideological themes. So the pediments were rather, filled with sculptures in the round, set within a sort of deep kind of cornice shelf and secured with metal pins. However, most of those sculptures have been destroyed or removed, but we know from the pinholes that are in the pediments, as well as drawings and 2nd century Greek writings, we know essentially what these pediments would have looked like. So we're looking at two proposed reconstructions of each. The west pediment, which was facing the entrance of the Acropolis, showed a contest between Athena and Poseidon for the patronage of Athens. And then the east pediment, which was over the entrance to the temple, depicts the birth of Athena as a fully formed adult armed with weaponry as she emerges from the head of Zeus, which is the legendary event that the city of Athens sort of celebrated. Each year they held a festival and a procession that ended at the Parthenon um, in honor of this birth of Athena. So we think Zeus was probably at the center of this pediment, flanked by Hera and Hephaestus, the god of fire, who aided in Athena's birth. Helios, the sun god, with his chariots, is in the left corner, while Selene, the moon goddess, with her chariot, is in the right corner, and then there are other gods and goddesses kind of reacting to the scene. But, as I mentioned, most of these pediment sculptures have been destroyed or removed. The British Museum owns what are called the Elgin marbles, which are essentially what is left of these pediment sculptures. At the Parthenon, there's also a frieze that sort of runs around the exterior that depicts various relief scenes of Greek mythology and history. On the south side of the building, we have, again, the Battle of the Lapiths and the Centaurs. So remember, the Centaurs got drunk at the wedding and assaulted the bride, and it culminated in a battle, right? So here we have one such relief. It sort of gives us one moment that represents this entire historical episode. We have this dramatic X composition created by implied diagonal lines that run through the human and the centaur as they sort of pull against each other and kind of balance each other as well. Now, on the north side of the Parthenon were reliefs featuring the Greeks battling against the Trojans. On the west, the Greeks battle the Amazons. And on the east, which is the front, the gods battle the giants. So we have this sort of consistent theme of the Greeks and or their divine allies overcoming what they perceived to be barbaric or uncivilized forces. The Parthenon, as we know it, was constructed or reconstructed after the defeat of after the defeat of the Persians by Athens, and it was sort of symbolic of that. So the theme here of the Greeks overcoming enemy forces is consistent and quite prominent. And so those reliefs would have run sort of along here around the exterior. So after exploring the exterior sculptures, visitors who had permission could enter the temple, and there they would encounter a 40-foot statue of Athena Parthenos. So this no longer exists, but we have sort of recreations based on ancient descriptions and much smaller scale reproductions to give us ideas of what it would have looked like. But it was made, of gold and ivory. So it depicts Athena, the patron goddess of Athens, as a warrior wearing her helmet and her goatskin breastplate, which is decorated with a gorgon head, so the head of Medusa. She holds a spear and a shield. A snake sort of wraps around one leg, and then in her other hand she holds a small figurine of the goddess of victory, Nike, as a clear symbol of Athena's victory over Poseidon for patronage of the city, but also Athens' victory over the Persians. Now there are also, we think, there were smaller details that sort of mirror the subjects that are on the exterior in relief. So on her sandals, we believe there were images of the Greeks battling the centaurs, on the shield, Greeks battling the Amazons, and on the exterior of the shield, and then on the interior, the gods battling the giants. So again, kind of carrying that theme of divine the divine right to rule, perhaps, of the Greeks over barbaric forces, carrying that from the exterior of the building to the interior as well. So Buddhist art focuses on the life and teachings of Buddha, or the Awakened One. So the Hindu prince Siddhartha Gautama, he was born sometime in the 6th century BC, we believe, and lived from about 563 to 483 BCE. So he lived in southern Nepal and northern India, and according to Buddhist belief, this prince was born a miraculous birth. He emerged from his mother's right side, and she felt no pain, and he could talk at birth. So it was prophesied that he was destined for greatness. Now remember, he was a prince, so his father, the king, really hoped that that meant that he would also be a great king, but that's not the case. However, the king tried to shield Siddhartha from age, illness, and death. So all sorts of suffering. He was raised in the royal palace as a prince, and again shielded from all suffering, and married at age 16. However, by age 29, Siddhartha was feeling restless, and he asked to leave the palace and went on a tour of the capital city. And while on his tour, he witnessed old people, he witnessed sick people, and then he witnessed a funeral procession. So all of the suffering he's been protected from throughout his entire life, illness, aging, and death, he encountered on this journey. So he was so moved by what he saw that he vowed to find a way to end such suffering for everyone. So first, he tried asceticism. He practiced a life of deprivation, essentially, but he almost starved to death because he was doing so. However, he achieved no clarity from this. Then he spent time meditating under the Bodha tree, and during this meditation, he was able to see all of his past lives and the whole of the universe, and he achieved enlightenment. So enlightenment, or nirvana, is considered a release from worldly desires that sort of ends the cycle of death and reincarnation and begins a state of permanent bliss, which is enlightenment or nirvana. So Siddhartha achieves this state and becomes the enlightened one, or Buddha, and then he preached self-denial and meditation across North India. And in seeking an answer to his question of human suffering, he arrived at the Four Noble Truths. The truth of suffering: existence is full of suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. To eliminate suffering, you need to eliminate desire. And to eliminate desire, you must follow the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path consists of the regulation of your speech, action, thought, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, concentration, and understanding. And these become the central tenets of Buddhism. Buddhism became institutionalized in about 273 to 232 BCE under the rule of Ashoka. We'll talk about him a bit more in a minute. But the stela that you see here depicts the life of the Buddha, the life of Siddhartha Gautama. So at the bottom, we have a scene of his miraculous birth. He emerges from the side of his mother. Above his birth, we have the moment he reaches enlightenment. He's sort of reaching down, touching the earth with a symbolic gesture of strength and renewal. Then, just above that, in sort of a third section, he's shown sitting with his legs crossed and his hands in a position of prayer, with the wheel of law behind him, the wheel of law being kind of the karmic wheel, or the laws of Buddhism. So this is the Buddha giving his first sermon. And then at the very top, you can see him sort of horizontally reclining there. This is him achieving nirvana, or eternal tranquility. Now, Along the side, we have smaller side carvings that kind of show noteworthy moments of his life after he leaves behind his princehood to become a holy man. So early Buddhist art actually avoided the depiction of Buddha directly. Um, he wasn't depicted in human form until about the 1st century. So we call this aniconic. So the forms they used, instead of being directly or literally representational, they were instead symbolic or suggestive. So symbols rather than forms associated with idols or images. Um, so one common symbol is footprints or Buddhapada to show the path of the Buddha. Sometimes we'll also see an empty throne signifying Siddhartha leaving the life of a prince. We'll see a Bodhi tree, so the moment and location of enlightenment. Sometimes we'll see a riderless horse that shows the Buddha traveling to preach. And again, the chariot wheel or the wheel of law or the wheel of prayer, which symbolizes Buddhist laws and teachings, or the wheel of life, so kind of that cycle of birth and rebirth. And even in narrative scenes where other figures are shown, typically the Buddha is shown symbolically up until the 1st century. So here we have the great stupa at Sanchi. So stupas were sort of sacred monuments. They sort of evolved from burial mounds, but they were erected at sacred locations and used to sort of house or bury relics. So the mound that you see, it looks as if it would be an architectural structure that you could enter, but it's actually not. You don't go inside of it. It's more of a burial mound that contains a relic. Anyway, so this particular stupa was built likely during the time of Ashoka, so during the early days of Buddhism. And it has 4 gateways that you can enter the structure. You can see one here and another here, so there would be a 3rd and a 4th. These are called Toranas, and they're topped with these very intricately carved scenes, as well as symbols from the Buddha's life and the Jataka tales, which are the stories of the Buddha's past lives. We'll talk more about the stupa itself a little bit later. For now, I want to talk about the carvings so that we can see an early kind of depiction of Buddha. So if we sort of zoom in on that central lintel, this shows the story of Prince Siddhartha leaving his princely life behind to begin his journey to enlightenment. So here, this is the lintel we're looking at, and we're starting sort of on the left here. So we have buildings and balconies. This represents the palace, and it's a little hard to see, but there's a horse kind of here within the palace, and then you can see him better just in front of the palace. But notice he doesn't have a rider, so a riderless horse. This symbolizes the presence of the Buddha as he sort of moves through the scene. In some cases, you can kind of see this umbrella or parasol-like form hovering over the horse. That is indicative of Buddha's presence. So, according to the story, as Prince Siddhartha left the palace, he was trying to do so quietly so as not to wake his family members or his father. The local gods, the yakshas, wanted him to succeed in his journey, so they cupped their hands under the horse's hooves so that no one would hear the hooves on the ground and awake. So the horse is sort of floating through or being carried through the scene from, again, just in front of the palace here, to the central tree, which this is the Bodhi tree, which indicates the sort of transition to the forest, but also maybe that moment of enlightenment. And then we see the horse kind of moving beyond into the forest, and here at the end we have a set of footprints, which indicates that the Buddha has dismounted and thus begun his holy life. The horse is sent back with the yakshas. Now there are also other symbols kind of around on this lintel that are also referencing the Buddha. So the Buddha was born into the Shakya-Ro lion clan, so the lions here symbolize the Buddha as the sage of that clan, but they also have these open mouths, which symbolize Buddha's sermon as the lions roar. And lions are also political. They're symbols of kingship, as are elephants, horses, and bulls, kind of symbols of worldly or military power. You can also see here and here, as well as a couple other places, a wheel, or that chakra, that symbol of the endless cycles of birth and rebirth, or the Dharma, the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism as taught by the Buddha. Could also be a chariot wheel, the wheel of the law, so Buddhist teachings and kind of the sermon that sets the wheel of the world rolling. Now we can also see these sort of pillars that seem to be topped with little figures, little animals maybe, underneath that wheel. So these are what we call Ashokan pillars. So these were monuments built by Ashoka, the emperor who sort of institutionalized Buddhism and helped spread it as faith and rule. And these were meant to serve as a sort of axis mundi, or a joining point between the human and divine realms. And notice they are topped with a lion, an Asiatic lion. So here Ashoka is really setting himself up as a kingly power, but also a moral authority, kind of in direct relation to the Buddha. So once the Buddha started to be depicted in human form, there are sort of certain indicators that begun to identify him. Now there are actually 32 distinguishing marks eventually, but we'll just look at a couple of them. First is the Urna, U-R-N-A, which is the sort of mark between the eyebrows. This symbolizes the third eye and the Buddha's ability to see beyond the mundane and beyond suffering into the divine. He also typically has what's called an Ushnishna. It's a little top knot, or a man bun, if you will. This is a symbol of his enlightenment. You can also see, it's a little hard to see in this image, but on the soles of his feet and the palms of his hands, he has the chakra, or impressions of a wheel. He also typically is wearing monk's robes, which go over the left shoulder. He has elongated arms, sort of long stretched earlobes. As a prince, he would have worn sort of heavy earrings to stretch them, so it's sort of an identifying feature. This particular depiction evolved from representations of the local gods, the yakshas, sort of indigenous male nature deities. Here the Buddha is shown with two attendants, and he has one arm raised in a gesture with meaning, which is called a mudra, M-U-D-R-A. And this particular mudra is a gesture meaning have no fear. He also has this sort of large scalloped halo behind his head, and you can see foliage kind of around that. So he's sitting under the Bodhi tree where he achieved enlightenment. and there are also some celestial beings kind of floating around above him. Um, and it's kind of interesting, his body is quite full and seems powerful. It doesn't look as if he has been starving himself in order to achieve enlightenment. And then if you notice too, there are again those Asiatic lions across the bottom of um, his little seat there. Here we have a 5th century depiction of the Buddha preaching his first sermon. This is from the Gupta period. The Guptas founded a dynasty in the eastern region of central India in the 4th century, but it didn't last a super long time, though it was rather expansive and culturally influential. We have the Buddha here sitting in a yogic position, again making those meaningful gestures or those mudras with his hands. These in particular indicate that this is the first sermon. Listeners surround the wheel which faces them, not us, which these could also potentially be seen as donors of the image instead of listeners to the sermon. Either way. There's sort of this focus within the Gupta period on elegance and inner peace. There's a sense of that otherworldly introspection or that achievement of enlightenment. We have the halo again behind the head, this time carved very sort of intricately to kind of balance the smoothness of the body. Again, can't see the urna, the dot as well here, but we have the Ushnishna, the top knot, and you can't see the chakras on the feet, but I do believe they're there. Artists have long interpreted stories from the Hebrew Bible to illustrate important Christian themes and events as well. Here, and very commonly in Christian art, we have this sort of idea of making the scriptures accessible to the general public, to those who couldn't read or those who didn't have access to the scriptures. So here we have the Hildesheim doors at the Abbey Church of St. Michael's in Hildesheim, Germany. These were made in the 11th century. The Bishop Bernward of Hildesheim was an important patron of the arts and himself a skilled goldsmith who really closely supervised the artists that worked for him. He commissioned a set of doors to show scenes from the book of Genesis on the left and from the life of Christ on the right. So each door is a single piece of cast bronze, and then it's sort of detailed and refined using chisels and tools. The scenes on the left and the right are complementary pairs that are meant to enhance each other's meanings. They feature rounded animated figures set within sort of spacious backgrounds, creating lively and visually stimulating, spontaneous kind of monumental forms. The doors read counterclockwise in chronological order, beginning at the top left, but the panels are arranged so that events from the Old Testament are paired with related scenes from the New Testament. In the third panel from the top on the left side, we have Eve accepting the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, and thus committing the original sin, and as a result, Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden into a world of suffering and death. And so the temptation scene has been paired with the crucifixion scene. So whereas on the left we have Eve accepting the fruit from the tree of knowledge, on the right we have Christ being crucified on the cross, or the tree of life, sort of symbolizing the offer of eternal life to the believers who ask forgiveness of their sins and accept Christ as their Savior. The elongated, sort of frail figures and the relatively non-naturalistic scenes, these are meant to reflect the Christian emphasis on the eternal or spiritual world and themes, rather than the external or physical world. Communication with the sacred is really important to many cultures. Sometimes that happens via specific individuals who serve as intermediaries between humans and deities or the divine. Um, Sometimes rulers are those intermediaries, or sometimes they are specific kind of um, religious individuals. Um, Much of Christian art involves saints and mythological figures interacting with God, sort of providing role models or helping educate viewers about various religious practices, but also acting as intermediaries between the individual and God. So in the Christian Eastern Orthodox Church in the Middle Ages, um, they started using what we call icons, sort of small, portable religious images that depicted holy figures. These were meant to sort of be a focus of devotion or a source of inspiration. Um, Christians and Jews prohibit graven images or idolatry, the worship of images, but they sort of made a distinction between idolatry and the veneration of the depiction of a holy idea or person. So icons were images of saints, the Virgin Mary, or Christ himself painted on walls or on portable panels that could be used as aids for prayer or meditation, and served as intermediaries between the worshiper and the holy person depicted. So the honor that was being given to the icon was transferred directly to the personage that was depicted. Icons were believed to have the power to communicate with God, and sometimes they held other miraculous powers. So on the left we have the Virgin and Child with saints and angels. This one's from the second half of the 6th century, and it is encaustic on wood panel. Mary was viewed as a very powerful intermediary who could appeal to her divine son on behalf of the devout, repentant worshippers. Here she's portrayed as sort of a throne for the baby Jesus himself, as she sits on a throne of her own. The two, the mother and child here, they're flanked by warrior saints Theodore and George, and then angels sort of stand behind them. The Virgin, Christ child, and angels are more illusionistic, maybe more lifelike, whereas the warrior saints are a bit more stylized. Their bodies are sort of hidden behind this flat patterned fabric. So maybe a bit of differentiation there between everyday individuals and the divine, or maybe the human and the divine. On the right, we have the Virgin of Vladimir. This icon was probably made in Constantinople and then brought to Kiev in Russia. It was made in the 12th century, sometime before 1132, but it has been retouched since then. So this shows an increasing desire for a more immediate and personal relationship with God within the religion. We have this kind of distinctly humanized characteristic or quality of the figures here. The artist using, the artist here is using an established iconographic type called the Virgin of Compassion. So it's an image of Mary and the Christ child sort of pressing their cheeks together and gazing affectionately at each other. This type of image first appears around the 10th century and was believed to have first been painted by St. Luke himself as a sort of reproduction of a divine vision that he had. So it became a sort of a sort of popular image for these Christian icons. And so the Virgin of Vladimir was thought to protect the people of the city where it resided. Art can also represent the connection of people to certain spiritual experiences. For example, this is Bernini's The Ecstasy of St. Teresa from 1647 to 52. So St. Teresa was a 16th century Spanish nun who had multiple visions of God. She was made a saint by the church, and so Bernini here is depicting a specific vision in which she saw an angel appear, and that angel then stabbed her several times in the heart with a flaming spear. Um, in some writings, she described the vision, saying she felt such an intense pain that it left her utterly consumed by the great love of God. The writings are rather erotic descriptions, kind of really emphasizing the intensity of her relationship with God. And so Bernini is trying to capture that here in this sculpture. We have quite dramatic, kind of turbulent and theatrical forms, very emotional and active. The figures sort of float above the horizon, above the surface there. The fabric seems to sort of billow out, kind of giving it this otherworldly or ethereal quality. Now, the figures here were cut from a large mass of marble, but they're supported by a pedestal that's fastened to the wall with hidden bars, so the scene actually appears to float. Teresa's swooning body is covered by a complex configuration of folds. Bernini is really a master here at simulating different textures and colors. If you compare the angel's drapery, it seems rather light and gauzy, maybe even silky, while Teresa's is rather heavy, seems to be made of wool or some sort of heavy material. But Bernini was also a master at capturing movement and emotion in his figures. So again, we have this depiction of a deeply spiritual individual, Saint Teresa, in religious ecstasy. And this is meant to sort of inspire within the viewer a sense of personal devotion to God.